The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet street in Riverwood, Alabama, where Rosa Thompson sat on her weathered porch. At 82, her silver hair gleamed like a crown of hard-earned wisdom, framing a face etched with lines that told stories of resilience and grace. Her kind eyes, still bright despite the years, shimmered with memories of a life fully lived as she rocked gently in her old wooden chair, its creaks a soft rhythm against the stillness. Her hands, rough and calloused from decades of toil, rested lightly on the armrests, a testament to the labor that had built her modest home a sanctuary she'd carved out on the outskirts of this small southern town. For over 50 years, this porch had been her vantage point, a place where she watched the world shift and change around her, from the segregated South of her youth to the gentrified neighborhood it had become. Born in the 1940s, Rosa had grown up in a world of rigid divides, where the color of her skin dictated the boundaries of her existence. She'd endured the brutality of the civil rights era, had marched with trembling steps beside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., felt the sting of fire hoses against her skin, and heard the snarls of police dogs echoing through the streets. Through it all, she'd raised her family with a fierce determination, planting in her children the seeds of dignity, perseverance, and education as weapons against a system designed to hold them back. Her greatest pride was her son, David Thompson, a man who had defied every odds stacked against him. Now 48, David had risen to become one of Alabama's most esteemed judges, his courtroom a place where justice wasn't just a word but a living principle. He carried himself with an unshakable integrity, his sharp mind cutting through the noise of prejudice to see the truth beneath. Yet, no matter how high he climbed, David never forgot the porch where his mother's stories had shaped him. Every Sunday, he'd pull up in his modest sedan, arms laden with grocery bags, and sit at her feet, soaking in the wisdom that flowed from her like a river. Rosa's neighborhood had transformed over the decades. Once a close-knit haven for black families, it now buzzed with new energy as white families moved in, their renovations stripping away the old charm and replacing it with sleek modernity. Property values soared, and Rosa watched it all unfold with a mix of fascination and unease. She greeted each newcomer with a warm smile, her natural kindness a bridge across the growing divide. But she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts, quick glances, the tightened grips on purses as she passed by. Still, she remained a cornerstone of the community, her small garden overflowing with vegetables she shared freely, her door always open with a plate of cornbread or a listening ear. Her house, with its chipped paint and vibrant flower beds, stood like a relic of resilience amid the polished new homes. On this particular afternoon, Rosa settled into her rocking chair with a glass of sweet tea, the ice clinking softly as she sipped. The street was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She nodded politely to Ms. Sullivan, a recent rival who strolled past with her poodle, its tiny paws clicking against the pavement. Rosa's smile faltered as she noticed the woman's pace quicken, her hand clutching her purse as if guarding a treasure. A pang of weariness tugged at Rosa's chest, a lifetime of such moments pressing down on her. She sighed, straightened her spine, and let the gentle sway of her chair carry her back to a place of peace. She'd faced worse than a nervous glance, far worse, and she wouldn't let it steal her calm. That calm shattered moments later when the piercing wail of sirens tore through the air. Rosa's eyes snapped open, her heart lurching as two police cruisers roared down the street, tires screeching as they stopped 3 doors down in front of Ms. Sullivan's house. Her breath caught, old memories flooding, backflashes of batons, shouted orders, and the cold grip of fear. She leaned forward, straining to see as 3 officers stepped out, 2 white men, their faces hard and unreadable, and a Hispanic woman whose expression hinted at a flicker of unease. Their hands rested near their holsters, a subtle threat in their stance as they approached Ms. Sullivan, who waved her arms frantically on her manicured lawn. Rosa's ears caught fragments of their words, "suspicious person, doesn't belong here," and a chill raced down her spine when she saw Ms. Sullivan's finger jab toward her porch. Before she could fully grasp the situation, the officers turned and marched toward her, their boots thudding against the cracked sidewalk. Rosa's grip tightened on the arms of her chair, her knuckles whitening as she willed her hands to stay steady. She could feel her pulse hammering in her ears, but she drew herself up, summoning the quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of battles. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with icy blue eyes and a buzzed haircut, stopped at the foot of her porch steps. "Ma'am," he barked, his voice sharp as a blade, "we've had a report of suspicious activity. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Rosa met his gaze, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. "Not at all, officer," she said, each word deliberate. "Though I'm not sure how I can help. I've been right here on my porch all afternoon, just enjoying the day." Her tone was steady, but beneath it, a thread of fear coiled tight. She knew how quickly these encounters could spiral. The younger officer, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, stepped forward, her tone softer but edged with suspicion. "Ma'am, a resident reported someone matching your description walking around, peering into windows. Can you tell us where you've been for the past hour?" Rosa's eyes widened, a spark of disbelief igniting within her. "Young lady," she replied, her voice rising slightly, "I've been sitting right here since after lunch. I haven't moved an inch, let alone gone wandering the neighborhood. At my age, that'd be quite the accomplishment." The third officer, a weary man with a smirk tugging at his lips, let out a scoff. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, crossing his arms. "Look, lady, we've got a witness who says different. Why don't you just admit what you were up to?" The words stung like a slap, and Rosa felt a surge of righteous anger flare in her chest. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Young man," she said, her voice trembling with indignation, "I've lived in this house for 48 years. I've got no reason to peek into anyone's windows, and I certainly don't have the desire. I'm a law-abiding woman, and I won't stand for you suggesting otherwise." The lead officer's face hardened, his posture shifting into something more menacing. "Listen," he growled, stepping closer, "we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. Just admit you were scoping out houses, and we'll handle this at the station." Rosa's hands shook now, but she clasped them together, her resolve unbreakable. "I've done nothing wrong," she said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere with you. If you've got questions, ask them right here on my porch." The air thickened with tension as the officers exchanged glances, their frustration boiling over. The lead officer's jaw clenched, his patience fraying. "You don't get to call the shots," he snapped. "We're questioning your right to even be here. Let's see some proof you live here." Rosa's patience snapped like a brittle twig. "I don't carry my ID to sit on my own porch," she shot back, her voice ringing with defiance. "My name's Rosa Thompson, and I've been here over half a century. Check the records if you don't believe me." The lead officer's eyes narrowed, his anger spilling over. "That's it," he barked. "If you won't cooperate, we're taking you in for obstruction. Stand up, hands behind your back." "No." Rosa's heart thundered, her mind racing to David, to the lessons she'd drilled into him about standing tall against injustice. She took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing. "I will not," she declared, her voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. "I've done nothing wrong, and I won't be treated like a criminal on my own property. If you want me gone, you'll have to drag me off this porch, and I swear I won't make it easy." The officers froze, their faces paling as the weight of her words sank in. In that moment, Rosa wasn't just an elderly woman. They saw the fire of a warrior who'd faced down far greater threats. And though they didn't know it yet, the arrival of her son, Judge David Thompson, would soon turn their bravado to ash, a stark reminder that justice, when abused, carries a heavy price. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across Rosa's weathered porch, where she sat in her creaking rocking chair, her frail hands gripping the armrests with a quiet resolve. The officers surrounding her, 3 men in crisp blue uniform, shifted uneasily, their boots scuffing the wooden planks as they traded fleeting, uncertain glances. They had come expecting compliance, perhaps a meek apology from an elderly woman caught in some minor misunderstanding. Instead, they found themselves facing a storm of defiance wrapped in a soft gray shawl. Rosa's dark eyes burned with a fire they hadn't anticipated, her silence louder than any protest. Inside, her heart thumped wildly, not from fear but from a desperate prayer for strength to endure, for someone to see, for justice to pierce through the oppressive haze settling over her home. The air grew thick with tension, a standoff teetering on the edge of chaos. The officers' voices overlapped in a low murmur as they debated their next step, their authority fraying with each passing second. Rose's lips moved faintly, forming silent pleas to a higher power, her mind racing with the indignity of it all. She was no stranger to struggle, but this violation on her own doorstep got deeper than she'd expected. Little did she know, fate was already steering a sharp turn her way, one that would unravel the fragile threads of power these men clung to, and send shockwaves far beyond her quiet street. Just as the lead officer, a burly man with a jaw tight as steel, raised his hand to issue a command, the smooth hum of an engine sliced through the moment. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb, its polished surface glinting under the fading light. The officers, so consumed by their confrontation, barely noticed until a voice deep, steady, and edged with unshakable authority rang out like a thunderclap. "What exactly is going on here?" Heads swiveled, eyes widened, and time seemed to stutter as a tall figure emerged from the vehicle. He was a man in his early 40s, his presence towering not just in stature but in the sheer weight of his demeanor. His tailored suit hugged his broad shoulders, every stitch screaming precision, and his polished shoes clicked against the pavement with purpose as he strode toward the porch. Rose's face softened, a flood of relief washing over her weary features. "David," she called, her voice trembling not from weakness, but from the overwhelming gratitude swelling in her chest. "Thank God you're here." The lead officer, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, squared his shoulders and stepped forward, his tone clipped. "Sir, this is a police matter. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." But David's gaze didn't waver. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept over the Senator's mother, small and unshaken despite the tremor in her hands, hemmed in by these uniformed figures radiating aggression. When he spoke again, his voice was a low simmer, fury bubbling just beneath its calm surface. "Officer, I am Judge David Thompson of the Alabama Superior Court, and this," he gestured to Rosa, his mother's name a shield and a sword, "is my mother. Now, I suggest you tell me why you're harassing an elderly woman on her own property before I make some calls none of you will enjoy." The words landed like a gavel, reverberating through the still air. The officers froze, their bravado evaporating as the truth sank in. The lead officer's face drained of color, his once commanding posture shrinking into something small and fragile. "Judge Thompson," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own miscalculation. We had no idea. There was a report of suspicious activity in the neighborhood." David silenced him with a raised hand, his expression darkening. "And you assumed my mother, a resident here for over 48 years, was your suspect. Based on what? Her age, her address, or something else you're too afraid to admit?" The officers fumbled, their excuses tripping over one another like clumsy children caught in a lie. Around them, the neighborhood stirred. Curtains twitched, doors creaked open, and a small crowd of onlookers gathered, drawn by the escalating drama. Among them stood Miss Sullivan, a weary woman in her late 50s, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her pinched face betrayed a growing unease as David's piercing gaze found her. "Ma'am," he called, his tone deceptively soft, "were you the one who made this report?" She shuffled forward, her eyes darting nervously between Rosa and the officers. I did call," she admitted, her voice thin and brittle. "I saw someone I didn't recognize walking around, with all the break-ins lately. David cut in, his words sharp as a blade. "And did this someone look anything like my mother?" Miss Sullivan hesitated, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson as she finally met Rosa's steady gaze. "I am not sure," she mumbled, shame curling her shoulders inward. "It happened so fast." David turned back to the officers, his face a mask of controlled outrage. "So, let me understand this. You got a vague call about a stranger, and your first instinct was to storm up here, intimidate my Mothra, pillar of this community, with it a shred of evidence or reason? Is that how you uphold the law?" The officers shrank further, their earlier swagger replaced by the wide-eyed panic of men who'd overplayed their hand. The neighbors watched in hushed awe, the ugly reality of what had almost unfolded settling over them like a heavy fog. "Rosa," still seated, rocked gently, her hands folded in her lap. Relief mingled with a deep, aching sadness in her chest. Her son's commanding presence had turned the tide. But the bitter truth lingered. She shouldn't have needed him to save her. Not here, not now, not after a lifetime of proving her worth. As David launched into a scathing dissection of the officer's legal and moral flourishes, voice rising with each violation, Rosa closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. She whispered a prayer of thanks for her son's arrival, but it was laced with something heavier, a plea for understanding, for a world where such scenes didn't repeat like a cruel refrain. The confrontation wasn't just about her anymore. It was a mirror held up to a community still scarred by prejudice, a lesson in the cost of unchecked power. The air shifted again when Rosa opened her eyes, her son's reprimands still echoing. Memories flooded her, decades of slights and battles, of raising David in a world that tried to dim his light, of shielding him from the same shadows that now loomed over her porch. She thought of the kids down the street, the ones who'd never have a judge strident to defend them. Something hardened inside her, a resolve forged in the crucible of this moment. "David," she called, her voice soft but cutting through the noise like a bell. "That's enough, son." All eyes turned to her as she rose, slow and deliberate, her small frame radiating a quiet majesty. The officers stilled, David paused, and even the neighbors leaned in, captivated by the strength in her stance. "What happened here today isn't just about me," she said, her chin lifting as she met each gaze in turn. "It's about every soul who looks like me, who doesn't have a son with a title to stand between them and a badge. We can't let this fade into silence." David's brow furrowed, concern flickering in his eyes, but pride shone brighter. "What do you want to do, Mom?" he asked, stepping closer. Rosa drew a deep breath, the weight of her years steadying her. "I want to file a formal complaint not just against these men, but against the whole department for letting this rot fester. And I want to speak out, tell my story, and lift up the voices of others who've faced this. It's time for change, and if I'm the one to light the fuse, so be it." The officers flinched, their dread palpable as the prospect of a judge's mother turning their actions into a public reckoning loomed. The neighbors murmured, some nodding in solidarity, others shifting uncomfortably as the fault lines of their community cracked open. David hesitated, then nodded, his voice firm. "If that's what you want, Mom, I'm with you. But it won't be easy." Rosa's eyes flashed, a spark of defiance igniting. "I've never backed down from what's right, and I'm not starting today." In the weeks that followed, Rosa's choice set off a tempest. Her complaint triggered an investigation that peeled back layers of misconduct within the police department, exposing a pattern of profiling and abuse that stretched far beyond her porch. Local reporters swarmed, then national outlets, her story swelling into a rallying cry for those long silenced. She stood before cameras and crowds, her voice steady despite the exhaustion tugging at her bones, recounting not just that day but a lifetime of resilience. The officers faced discipline, Miss Sullivan retreated into quiet guilt, and David remained her rock, guiding her through the storm she'd unleashed. For Rosa, it was more than justice, it was a testament to the consequences of power misused, a warning etched in the courage of one woman who refused to bow. Rosa Thompson drew immense courage from the unwavering presence of her son, David, and the quiet certainty that her actions were carving a path towards something greater. Every day, she felt the weight of her choice to stand up, to speak out settled deeper into her bones, a mixture of pride and exhaustion swirling in her chest. Yet, the road she'd chosen was far from smooth. The consequences of her defiance weren't all bathed in light. Shadows crept in, 2 threatening phone calls that jolted her awake in the dead of night, the harsh buzz of the receiver cutting through the stillness of her modest home. Anonymous letters arrived, their words scrawled in jagged, angry ink, accusing her of betraying the very system that kept order, branding her a menace to law enforcement. She'd sit at her kitchen table, the faint hum of a flickering bulb overhead, tracing the venomous lines with her finger, her heart pounding yet resolute. Her once warm neighborhood shifted beneath her feet. Where there had been friendly waves and shared cups of coffee on porches, there was now a chill. Some neighbors, uneasy with the spotlight her case cast over their quiet streets, turned their backs, Their eyes avoided hers as they hurried past, their footsteps quick and deliberate on the cracked sidewalks. Rosa felt the sting of their distance, a quiet ache blooming in her chest as she watched the community she'd known for decades fracture. The police department, meanwhile, bristled under the scrutiny she'd unleashed. In their cramped precinct, surrounded by peeling paint and the drone of overworked air conditioning, they scrambled to protect their own. Their initial response was a clumsy counterattacking through dusty records to unearth trivial missteps from Rosa's distant past, a parking ticket from 1978, a forgotten Finian thing to smear her name. But Rosa's life had been one of quiet integrity, her reputation a shield to sturdy for their flimsy arrows. Their efforts crumbled, and the public's anger only swelled, a roaring tide crashing against the department's fragile defenses. Through it all, David stood like an oak at her side, his broad shoulders squared with determination. A judge with deep roots in the legal world, he wielded his influence like a blade, cutting through bureaucracy to ensure his mother's voice wasn't drowned out. Late nights found him hunched over his desk, the glow of a lamp illuminating stacks of legal briefs as he rallied colleagues to her cause. Securing her the sharpest attorney's money couldn't buy the work for principle, not pay. But his loyalty came at a cost. Whispers slithered through the marbled halls of the courthouse, murmurs questioning his objectivity. Can he rule fairly on police matters now? They'd hiss over coffee in the break room, their voices low but sharp. The tension gnawed at him, a slow burn in his gut as he weighed his career against his mother's fight. Yet, when he looked into Rosa's steady eyes, he knew there was no turning back. As weeks stretched into months, Rosa's stand ignited a fire that spread beyond her own battle. Her case became a spark, lighting up conversations about race and power that had long simmered beneath the surface of their small town. Town hall meetings sprang up, the air thick with anticipation as folding chairs scraped across scuffed wooden floors. Residents packed the room, their faces a mosaic of hope, anger, and uncertainty. Police officers sat stiffly in their starched uniforms, their jaws tight, while community leaders paced the stage, microphones crackling with every impassioned word. Rosa found herself at the heart of it all, her soft-spoken grace commanding attention. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her presence calm, unyielding drew respect even from those who'd once crossed the street to avoid her. She began speaking to local youth groups, her voice steady as she recounted her story under the fluorescent glare of community center lights. The kids, wide-eyed and restless, hung on her words, their sneakers squeaking on the linoleum as they shifted in their seats. She urged them to rise up, to demand fairness, but also to reach out to mend the frayed threads between their lives and the badge-wearing figures they'd been taught to fear. The weight of her new role pressed down on her, though. Nights stretched long and sleepless, her bedroom cloaked in darkness as doubts crept in like uninvited guests. Had she traded too much her peace, her privacy for this uncertain fight? Her body ached, her joints protesting the endless days of meetings and marches. But then dawn would break, and with it came a letter slipped under her door, a shaky, handwritten note from a teenager she'd inspired, thanking her for showing them courage was possible. Or she'd catch a news segment on the flickering TV in her living room, the anchor's voice detailing reforms creeping into the police department's policies. In those moments, clarity washed over her, cool and certain as a river. She'd chosen this path, and it was the right one. Sitting on her weathered porch each evening, the sky bruising purple above her, Rosa would replay the words she'd spoken to David that first day. It's time for a change, and if I have to be the one to start it, then so be it. Back then, she couldn't have fathomed how those words would ripple outward, how they'd demand so much of her spirit. Yet, as she gazed at the houses lining her street, their windows glowing with the lives within, a fierce purpose pulsed through her, stronger than ever. Meanwhile, a quieter storm brewed within Officer Emily Garcia, a young Hispanic woman who'd stood on the sidelines during Rosa's confrontation with the police. The memory haunted her. Rosa's steady gaze, the crackle of tension in the air, the way her colleagues had flexed their authority like a weapon. While her fellow officers locked arms in defiance, Emily felt a splintering inside her, a gnawing sense that they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Guilt coiled in her stomach, tightening with every shift she worked. She started a journal, its pages hidden beneath her mattress, where she scribbled notes in the dim glow of a bedside lamp, dates, times, names of officers who smirked as they recounted stops that reeked of bias. Her pen trembled as she wrote, her breath shallow, knowing each entry pulled her deeper into a dangerous game. The precinct buzzed with loyalty to the old ways, and she could feel the eyes of her peers boring into her back, sensing her drift. Across the street, Miss Sullivan wrestled with her own unraveling. She'd been the one to dial 911 that day, her voice trembling as she reported Rosa, convinced she was doing the right thing. Now, the community's scorn rained down on her neighbors glaring over hedges, her mailbox stuffed with letters calling her a bigot. The weight of it crushed her, her mornings spent staring out her window, coffee growing cold in her hands as shame gnawed at her. Desperate to shed the guilt, she knocked on Rosa's door one rainy afternoon, her umbrella dripping onto the porch as she stammered an apology. Rosa listened, her face unreadable, as Miss Sullivan's words tumbled out, raw and tear-soaked. Then, in a voice soft but firm, Rosa shared her own story, decades of quiet resilience as a black woman in a world that often refused to see her. The air between them shifted, heavy with understanding, and from that fragile moment, an unlikely bond took root. Miss Sullivan, once the accuser, began showing up at Rosa's side, her nervous energy channeled into a fierce resolve to right her wrong. The town itself was a cauldron of change. The city council, prodded by activists emboldened by Rosa's courage, debated police reforms in packed chambers, the air thick with sweat and shouting. Some residents cheered the push for accountability, others clung to the comfort of tradition, their voices rising in defense of the status quo. Judge David Thompson navigated this divide with a tightrope walker's grace, his robes feeling heavier each day as colleagues cast sidelong glances. Some admired his backbone, others whispered he'd tainted his gavel with bias. The police, desperate to polish their tarnished badge, rolled out community picnics and training sessions, officers forcing smiles as they handed out hot dogs. But the crowd's skepticism hung like fog. Few believed the gestures ran deeper than skin. Emily's journal grew thicker, its pages a damning ledger of misconduct. She wrestled with the choice to speak out, her nights spent pacing her tiny apartment, the floorboards creaking under her boots. Then came a chance meeting with Judge Thompson, their hushed talks unfolding in shadowed diners, coffee cups trembling in their hands. The stakes loomed large. Her career, his reputation, but the truth burned brighter. Miss Sullivan, meanwhile, launched a neighborhood group, her kitchen table cluttered with flyers as she rallied residents to talk, to listen. The meetings were messy, voices clashing as old wounds split open. But they inched toward something real. These threads, Rosa's resolve, Emily's rebellion, Miss Sullivan's redemption, wove together, tightening the fabric of a community on the brink. Rosa's fight laid bare the cost of power unchecked, a lesson etched in every tense glance, every whispered doubt. Justice, they learned, wasn't a gift, it was a battle, fought in the open and in the shadows, demanding sacrifice from all who dared to claim it. As evening settled over her porch once more, Rosa watched the stars prick the sky, her heart steady with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. On the weathered wooden porch of Rosa Thompson's modest home, where the afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the peeling paint, a quiet ritual unfolded. What had once been a simple gathering for tea between Rosa and her neighbor, Miss Emily Sullivan, had blossomed into something far more profound, a living testament to the power of reconciliation and the fragile beauty of personal growth. The creak of the rocking chairs mingled with the hum of cicadas as the two women sat together, their conversations weaving a tapestry of shared history and hard-earned understanding. Miss Sullivan, a woman whose lined face bore the weight of past mistakes, leaned forward with a hunger to listen, her gray eyes wide and attentive. She soaked in every word as Rosa, her voice steady yet rich with emotion, recounted the trials of her youth during the civil rights era, days marked by fear, defiance, and an unyielding hope. One humid afternoon, as the scent of sweet tea lingered in the air, Rosa set her glass down on the wobbly porch table and turned to her companion. "You know, Emily," she said, her tone soft but deliberate, using Miss Sullivan's first name with a warmth that carried years of unspoken forgiveness. When I was your age, I couldn't have dreamed of a day like this, sitting here, sharing a quiet moment with a white neighbor, someone who once called the police on me." Her words hung between them, heavy with memory. Miss Sullivan's breath caught in her throat, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her own glass. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over to trace paths down her cheeks. "Rosa," she whispered, her voice breaking under the strain of remorse. "I can't even begin to tell you how much shame I carry for that day. But this chance to sit with you, to learn from you, it's more than I deserve. I'm so grateful." The sincerity in her words was raw, unguarded, and it deepened the bond between them. A bond forged not just in forgiveness, but in the painful recognition of past wrongs. Their unlikely friendship rippled outward, catching the attention of the neighborhood like a stone tossed into still water. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around the edges of the conflict, wary of choosing sides in what had been a bitter local dispute, found themselves drawn to the quiet strength of these two women. On warm evenings, they'd glance toward Rosa's porch, where laughter and murmured conversation drifted through the air, and something shifted within them. The icy mistrust that had long gripped the community began to melt, slowly at first, then with a steady thaw that promised something new. It was a lesson in justice, and not the kind handed down in courtrooms, but the kind built through patience and the courage to face one's own flaws. Meanwhile, in the shadowed corners of the town, another relationship was taking shape, one fraught with tension and tempered by mutual respect. Officer Emily Garcia, a young woman with sharp features and a restless conscience, had begun meeting secretly with Judge David Thompson, a man whose stern demeanor hid a soul wrestling with its own moral compass. Their clandestine rendezvous softened in the quiet seclusion of a local park, where the rustling leaves masked their voices, centered on Emily's growing stack of evidence, meticulous notes documenting police misconduct that gnawed at her sense of duty. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the park's benches stood empty, Emily's resolve faltered. She paced the gravel path, her boots crunching against the stones, and finally stopped to face the judge. "Judge Thompson," she said, her voice low and trembling, "if I bring this forward, my career's finished, everything I've worked for gone. But if I stay silent, how do I live with myself?" Her dark eyes searched his face, desperate for an answer. David, his broad shoulders hunched under the weight of his own doubts, met her gaze with a steady calm. "Emily," he replied, his voice deep and measured, "the road to doing what's right is never smooth. It's a jagged path, full of sacrifice, but it's the only one worth walking." Their shared resolve, born from the ashes of personal risk, wove a thread of trust between them, a partnership that went beyond badges and gavels. It was a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice often demanded a steep price, and that those who abused their power would one day face the consequences of their choices. Closer to home, Rosa's bond with her son, David, who also happened to be Judge Thompson, deepened in ways neither had anticipated. They had always been close, tethered by a quiet love that needed few words. But now, united by a cause that stretched beyond their family, they became something more, comrades in a fight for fairness. One evening, as the sky above the porch turned a bruised shade of purple, David sat beside his mother, his tall frame folded into the chair next to hers. He reached for her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers with a tenderness that belied his usual reserve. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with admiration, "I've always been proud of you. But what you're doing now, this strength, this fire, it's more than I ever imagined." Rosa turned to him, her eyes catching the last rays of daylight, sparkling with a mix of pride and mischief. She squeezed his hand back, her grip firm and warm. "Well, son," she chuckled, "where do you think you got that sense of justice from? It sure didn't come from those dusty law books you're always buried in." Their laughter spilled into the twilight, a rich, rolling sound that danced on the breeze, a celebration of a love that had only grown fiercer through the storms they'd weathered together. Rosa's influence didn't stop at her porch. The wider community, once content to see her as just another gray-haired figure tending her garden, began to look at her differently. She became a beacon of wisdom, a moral anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Young activists, their faces alight with passion, knocked on her door seeking guidance, hanging on her every word as she shared stories of resistance and resilience. Older residents, who'd known her for decades, shook their heads in quiet awe, marveling at the unquenchable spirit that had simmered beneath her gentle exterior all along. During a packed community meeting at the local church, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and murmured anticipation, a young black man rose to his feet. His voice quivered with emotion as he addressed her. "Miss Thompson," he said, his hands clenched at his sides, "watching you stand up to those officers. Hearing what you've been through, it's given me hope. Real hope that things can change." Rose's gaze swept over the crowd, a sea of faces, black, white, young. Odell turned toward her with a reverence that made her chest tighten. Tears pricked at her eyes as she realized her solitary act of defiance had ignited something larger, a spark that was fanning into a flame of collective healing. Not every shift in relationships brought harmony, though, for Officer Garcia, the cost of her secret crusade weighed heavily. At the precinct, where the clatter of radios and the shuffle of boots once felt like home, she now walked alone. Colleagues who'd once slapped her on the back with easy camaraderie now eyed her with suspicion, their conversations falling silent when she approached. The unspoken code of loyalty among the force, a shield that protected even the worst abuses of power, had begun to crack, and Emily felt the chill of isolation settle into her bones. Similarly, Judge Thompson's once cordial ties with his fellow jurists frayed as Rose's case stirred controversies. Why? The casual lunches in bustling diners and invitations to weekend barbecues dwindled, replaced by stiff nods in the echoing corridors of the courthouse. Yet even these strained connections served a purpose, laying bare the rot of corruption and prejudice that justice demanded be uprooted. The consequences of wielding authority without accountability were becoming impossible to ignore. As these relationships twisted and turned, they formed a sprawling web that mirrored the community's own evolution. Each encounter, whether it drew people together in unity or drove them apart in conflict, reflected the broader battle for understanding and equity. Rosa, watching from her perch on the porch, saw it all unfold with a clarity honed by years of struggle. She understood that true change wasn't just about rewriting laws or reforming policies. It was about the slow, messy work of mending hearts and building trust. As she rocked gently, the fading light painting the world in hues of amber and shadow, a quiet hope bloomed within her. The bonds being tested and forged in this crucible of adversity were the foundation of a future where justice might finally prevail. The day of the town hall meeting arrived like a storm rolling over the horizon, its tension crackling in the air. The community center, a squat brick building usually reserved for bake sales and bingo nights, was transformed into a battleground of ideals. Inside the cavernous auditorium, every seat was taken, the crowd spilling into the Aisel's residence from every corner of town. Local officials in starched suits and reporters with notebooks poised. Rosa sat in the front row, her spine ramrod straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. To her left sat David, his jaw tight with resolve. To her right, Miss Sullivan, nervously twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Across the stage, the police chief and a handful of officers, including Emily Garcia, occupied their own territory, their faces a mixture of defiance and unease. The air buzzed with unspoken questions, the weight of anticipation pressing down on everyone as the mayor stepped to the podium. "We're here today," he began, his voice booming through the hall, "to address what happened to Mrs. Rosa Thompson and to confront the bigger issues it's uncovered in our town." At first, the meeting unfolded with a veneer of civility. Community leaders took turns at the microphone, their words measured and rehearsed. But when the floor opened to the public, the thin thread of decorum snapped. A burly man with a flushed face leapt up, his voice a thunderclap. "The police were just doing their job. We can't hobble them when they're keeping us safe." Across the room, a young black woman shot to her feet, her eyes blazing. "And who keeps us safe from them? Who protects us when the protectors turn predator?" The room erupted, years of buried anger and fear surging to the surface. Voices clashed like swords, the mayor's gavel banging uselessly against the rising tide of chaos. Then, amidst the uproar, Emily Garcia stood. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, but her steps were sure as she crossed to the podium. "I have something to say," she called out, her voice slicing through the din. The crowd hushed, every eye locking onto her as she pulled a thick folder from her bag. "For months," she said, her tone steadying with each word, "I've been recording what's really happening in our department: racial profiling, abuse, a pattern of wrong. What happened to Mrs. Thompson wasn't a fluke. It's a symptom, and it has to end." The room exploded anew, her fellow officers staring at her with a mix of disbelief and fury, the police chief's face darkening with betrayal. But in that moment, Emily stood tall, a solitary figure against the storm, embodying the truth that justice, though costly, was worth every sacrifice, and that those who misused their power could no longer hide in the shadows. The air in the room thickened with tension as his face flushed a startling crimson, words tumbling from his mouth in a chaotic jumble, barely coherent. Around him, the community erupted. Some voices rose in fierce admiration of Emily's courage, their shouts ringing with pride for her willingness to stand against the tide, while others hurled accusations, their tones sharp with betrayal, convinced she had forsaken the very oath she'd sworn to uphold. Amid the clamor, a figure emerged from the crowd, her frail frame belying the strength she carried. Rosa, her silver hair catching the dim light, moved with a quiet determination that seemed to hush the chaos as she approached the podium. Emily, her chest tight with a mix of relief and uncertainty, stepped aside, yielding the space to the older woman whose presence alone demanded reverence. Rosa stood tall, her weathered hands gripping the podium's edge, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, some flushed with anger, others glistening with unshed tears. "Look at us," she began, her voice cutting through the din with a clarity that felt almost tangible, resonating in the hollows of every listener's chest. "Look at what we're doing to one another. This rage, this fear, it's tearing us apart, thread by thread. This is precisely why we need change, but not the kind that comes from drowning each other out or pointing trembling fingers in blame." Her words hung heavy, stirring something dormant in the crowd, a flicker of recognition, a shared ache. As she spoke, the room seemed to shift. The suffocating heat of fury began to cool, replaced by a tentative whisper of something softer, something human. Rose's eyes, sharp yet kind, met theirs as she pressed on. "We stand at a crossroads. We can let this fracture us beyond repair, or we can seize it, grasp this jagged moment, and weave it into a chance to listen, to understand, to build something enduring. The road ahead will be steep, but the things that matter most never come easy." Her final words lingered like a melody fading into silence, the weight of truth settling over the room. The town hall had erupted into a storm, but now it stood still, raw and exposed. The community teetered on the edge of a choice whether to embrace the grueling labor of mending what had been broken or to let the chasm widen until it swallowed them whole. In the days that followed, Rosa Thompson found herself thrust into the heart of a movement, a reluctant beacon amid the turmoil. The echoes of that night fueled a whirlwind of activity. Heated arguments flared in living rooms, earnest pleas spilled across kitchen tables, and restless energy pulsed through the streets as factions scrambled to chart a course forward. Recognizing the chaos of the public forum had overwhelmed too many voices, Rosa gathered a small circle of Semley Garcia, her brow still furrowed with the weight of her decision, David, a steady presence with a quiet resolve, and other local leaders whose hearts beat for progress. Together, they carved out spaces for smaller gatherings, intimate rooms where the air wasn't thick with shouting, but soft enough for vulnerability. One such meeting unfolded in a modest community center, its walls lined with faded posters and mismatched chairs. A diverse group settled in, longtime residents with deep roots, newcomers clutching deeds to their first homes, and shopkeepers whose livelihoods hung in the balance. The tension crackled like static as Rosa rose, her voice a gentle anchor. "We're not here to accuse or condemn," she said, her tone warm yet unyielding. "We're here to hear each other, to dig into the mess of it all. Every soul in this room carries a story, a fear, a hope. Our task is to find a way that honors them all." The conversation unfurled slowly, haltingly. An elderly man, his white hair thinning and his hands trembling with decades of memory, broke the silence. "I've called this place home for 40 years, he rasped, his voice rough with emotion. "And now it feels foreign. It's not about color, it's about walking my own streets and feeling like I don't belong." Across the circle, A young black woman leaned forward, her braids swaying as she spoke, her voice quivering with a quiet fire. And we feel that too, like this should be our home. But instead we're threats, shadows to be feared. Can you imagine what it's like to be judged just for breathing here? The exchange cut deep. A raw wound laid bare, and Rosa watched, her heart heavy but steady, guiding the group through the pain toward a fragile thread of understanding. Beyond these circles, Rosa turned her focus inward, joining Emily and David to confront the rot within the police department. They ranged tense, trembling meeting officers in crisp uniforms facing residents whose eyes burned with distrust, a mediator's calm voice threading through the storm. In one session, a young man, his shoulders hunched from years of scrutiny, spoke up, his words thick with hurt. "Every time I walk out my door, I'm a suspect, just for existing." Across the table, an older officer, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights, shifted uncomfortably, his face softening. "I didn't see it," he admitted, his voice low. "We're taught to watch, to protect. But I get it now, vigilance without heart can twist into something cruel." These flickers of connection, though fleeting, were lifelines, and Rosa clung to them, knowing each one nudged them closer to a reckoning. Their efforts stretched beyond words into action. Rosa pressed city officials, her voice unwavering as she demanded transparency over boards to hold power accountable, training that taught officers to see the humanity before the threat. But the path was littered with obstacles. A shooting in a nearby town sent shockwaves through their fragile progress, sparking protests that roared through the night, fists raised and voices raw. Rosa met the surge head-on, organizing a peace walk, not a march of anger, but a quiet procession of unity. Neighbors who'd never met linked hands, their footsteps a soft rhythm on the pavement, their conversations weaving threads of possibility through the dusk. Months passed, and the fruits of their labor began to bloom, tentative but real. Reports of profiling dwindled, trust in the police crept upward, and the oversight board, after stumbling through its infancy, stood firm as a pillar of accountability. Rosa's gospel of listening, of seeking common ground, rippled outward. Neighborhood councils adopted her methods. Schools taught children to navigate difference with grace. Yet she knew some scars ran too deep to fully heal, some divides too wide to bridge in a lifetime. Success, she realized, wasn't a perfect peace, but a space where truth could breathe, where justice could inch forward. Late at night, alone with her thoughts, Rosa traced the arc of her life from marching beside Dr. King, her young voice lost in a chorus of hope, to this fractured present. His words echoed in her mind. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. She'd seen power twist and crush, watched it blind those who wielded it. But here, in this slow, stubborn fight, she saw its lesson. Justice demanded patience, vigilance, and a refusal to let fear win. The consequences of unchecked authority had scarred her community, but in its wounds, she found purpose, a call to keep bending that arc, step by grueling step. On a quiet evening, Rosa Thompson sat on her weathered porch, the soft creak of the wooden boards beneath her chair blending with the distant hum of crickets. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed her small neighborhood in warmth, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked pavement. She traced her fingers along the armrest, her mind drifting to the remarkable distance they'd traveled, each painstaking effort, every heated discussion, and all the tiny victories were threads in a vast tapestry, weaving together a journey toward something greater, a society where fairness wasn't just a dream, but a foundation. The road ahead stretched far beyond the horizon, unfinished and daunting, yet a flicker of hope burned brighter within her than ever before. She understood now that their work are solving conflicts. Mending divides weren't merely about fixing the present. It was about planting seeds for a future where understanding could take root, a legacy for generations she'd never meet. The past months had been a whirlwind of transformation. What started as a terrifying clash right there on her porch, a moment when her heart pounded so fiercely she thought it might break free, had spiraled into something extraordinary. Rosa could still feel the chill of that day, the way her hands trembled as voices rose and tempers flared. But from that chaos, a movement had blossomed, touching every corner of their tight-knit community. Neighborhood meetings stretched late into the night, voices hoarse but determined. Policy reforms were debated over endless cups of coffee, and personal revelations unfolded in quiet corners each step, reshaping not just the streets around her, but Rosa herself. The fear that once gripped her had morphed into resolve, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. One evening, as she sat lost in thought, the sharp ring of her phone jolted her back to the present. She fumbled with the receiver, her arthritic fingers slow but steady, and a voice crackled through the linea mayor from a nearby city. He'd heard whispers of the remarkable changes rippling through Rosa's neighborhood, tales of dialogue replacing distrust, of policies bending toward justice. His words carried a weighty request. Would she share their story, their strategies, with other struggling communities? Rosa's breath caught in her throat. The idea of stepping onto a larger stage thrilled her, but it also stirred a deep unease. At nearly 80, she'd lived a life of quiet resilience, raising her son David, weathering loss, and holding her community together through unspoken strength. To thrust herself into the spotlight, to shoulder responsibilities that felt impossibly vast, seemed a leap too far. She hung up, her mind a storm of doubt and possibility. That night, she gathered her closest allies, David, with his steady gaze and unshakable faith in her; Emily Garcia, the young police officer whose own journey mirrored the community's; and M. Sullivan, the gray-haired widow whose sharp wit had a heart softened by their shared cause. They crowded into her cramped living room, the air thick with the scent of brewed tea and the weight of their decision. Rosa's voice trembled as she spoke, but her words carried a fire. What we've built here reaches bigger than us now. We could spark something across the country, change how people see the police, how they see each other. David nodded, his eyes reflecting pride and a trace of worry. Emily fidgeted with her mug, her brow furrowed. She knew the resistance they'd face, the skepticism from her fellow officers. Sullivan, ever the realist, leaned forward, her voice gravelly but warm. It won't be easy, Rosa, but if anyone can do this, it's you. After hours of debate, Rosa made her choice. She'd say yes, not just for their neighborhood, but for every community teetering on the edge of fracture. The decision felt like a stone dropping into a still pond, its ripples spreading far beyond her sight. Energized yet apprehensive, the group dove into planning. They envisioned an initiative of understanding dedicated to equipping communities with tools to confront racial bias in policing and forge stronger bonds with law enforcement. It would unite leaders, officers, and advocates in a shared mission, drawing from the hard-earned lessons of their own struggle. Rosa pictured it clearly: workshops in dimly lit town halls, training sessions where guarded faces softened into curiosity, and conversations that pierced through decades of mistrust. Word of their bold new direction spread like wildfire. The community buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose. Local shop owners, like Mr. Patel from the corner store, offered donations, just weathered hands pressing cash into Rosa's palms with a quiet nod of respect. Schools wove conflict resolution into their lessons, children practicing empathy where adults had faltered. Even a handful of officers, inspired by Emily's courage, stepped forward, eager to share their own stories of doubt and growth with departments beyond their own. But not everyone embraced the shift. Some grumbled in the grocery aisles, fearing national ambitions would siphon energy from their still healing streets. Others whispered about the scrutiny a higher profile would bring, cameras flashing, questions probing. Rosa felt their unease like a weight on her chest, yet her conviction held firm. Justice demanded more than complacency. It required courage, even when the path grew steep. The day they secured a modest office space for bridges of understanding, Rosa stood before its peeling facade, her heart a tangled dance of excitement and dread. The building was unremarkable fade paint, a crooked sign, but to her, it was a beacon. She traced the journey back to that porch confrontation, the moment fear had ignited purpose. Now, it had led her here, to the cusp of a movement that could echo across state lines. As she pushed open the door, dust swirling in the sunlight, she felt the enormity of what lay ahead. The real work, grueling, soul-testing work, was only beginning. In the months that followed, Rosa found herself gazing into the mirror each morning, studying the woman staring back. The lines etched into her face told stories of nearly 8 decades: joy, sorrow, survival, but her eyes held something new, a spark of defiance, a clarity forged through trial. The confrontation that had shaken her, the community's upheaval, the relentless push of their initiative, it had stretched her beyond what she'd thought possible. She'd faced jeering crowds at town halls, wrestled with the tangled roots of systemic bias, and carried the hopes of countless voices she'd never hear. Through it all, she'd unearthed a resilience she hadn't known slept within her, a strength that outshone even the adversities of her past. Her view of the world had shifted, too. Once, she'd seen change as a quiet act helping a neighbor, raising David right. Now, she grasped how a single spark could blaze into a revolution, how one story could unravel entrenched wrongs. She'd learned the power of listening, truly listening to voices hardened by pain, and the necessity of empathy as a bridge over chasms of prejudice. Leadership, too, had reshaped her. The woman who'd once shunned attention now stood before cameras, her voice steady as she spoke to audiences of strangers. She'd mastered the art of weaving coalition social workers, skeptical sheriffs, fiery activists into a fragile but growing alliance. It wasn't easy. The responsibility pressed down on her, a constant reminder that her missteps could ripple far. Doubt crept in during sleepless nights. Was she too old, too ordinary for this? But then she'd recall that day, her trembling words to David, "If I have to start it, so be it." And she'd press on. Her relationships had deepened, too, each bond a testament to their shared fight. David, her rock, had become her partner, their late-night talks blending motherly pride with mutual respect. Sullivan, once just a neighbor with a knack for gardening, had emerged as a confidant to her, dry humor cutting through tension, her quiet faith in Rosa a steadying force. And Emily had evolved from a symbol of the system's flaws into a friend, her redemption a living proof of what they sought. As Rosa prepared for another day meeting, stacked, interviews looming, she felt a swell of gratitude. That Porch incident had stripped away her illusions, forcing her to face society's fractures and her own limits. It had been a crucible, forging her into an advocate, a leader, a symbol of what justice could demand and reward. The lesson was clear: power, unchecked, bred pain in her porch, in her streets, across the nation. But justice, pursued with heart and grit, could heal. Rosa Thompson, once a quiet elder bullied in her own home, had risen as something greater. As she looked to the future, the weight of her years felt lighter, buoyed by purpose. The arc of their journey bent ever toward equity, and she was ready to lead, ready to fight, ready to build bridges where walls once stood.